Whenever the Christmas day comes, parents would often say to their kids that Santa would reward them if they were nice, and if they were naughty, they wouldn't receive anything. The kids would follow these rules to get rewarded until they grow out of the belief about the man climbing down their chimneys at night. However, the same cannot be said to the children of Ostendale Orphanage. For the kids who did not grow up with their parents, they saw Santa Claus as a taste of parental love. Since fathers often played the part of Santa for their children, some orphans considered the fictional man in the red suit as a father figure. They cherished the image of the man who only visited once every year, but things had changed in one particular night when the actual Santa had decided to appear. Unfortunately, he was not the kind of man that we believed him to be. While the nice kids were rewarded by delightful gifts, the naughty ones were punished by their worst fears. The Ostendale Orphanage was founded by a kind-hearted family who were long gone when I arrived there. The quarters were filled with cracks, and the wooden flooring was missing some planks. The building as a whole was not in a good shape, but we would have died of cold if not for their kindness to give roof over our heads. During winter, we get surrounded by a sea of snow. Being far from the main city, nobody bothered to plow the streets since it wasn't often used. We never had enough supplies of basic necessities. Our beddings used to be white, and they had turned ash gray with multiple patches to cover the rips and the holes that accumulated for years of use. Our clothes were all hand-me-downs, and many things were to cover our needs. Our kind of lifestyle had made the day of Christmas more special for us orphans. If our budget would cut it, or if any sponsor would care to share, we would receive some new things once every year. Every Christmas, our guardian, Sister Rosie, would ask us to write down what we wanted to receive as a gift. As children who only wanted simple things, our wishes were often just small, like a new pair of gloves, a new pillow, a mug, or any of the likes. However, only the nicest kids would have his wish come true. We would write them down on a letter and then put them in a box. Sister Rosie would say that she would send it to Santa Claus. Some kids actually believed in him even though we never saw him. And we did. Something else happened. Instead of a magical encounter with the big man in a red suit, it turned out to be the most horrifying night that we would never forget. When the Christmas night finally came, we were all too excited to fall asleep. The other kids and I were hiding beneath our sheets as we closely listened to the creaks of the floor. We always put up the Christmas tree in the activity area, and our quarters were right beside it. When someone would head to the area, we would hear their footsteps on the hallway because of the creaky flooring. But this time around, we heard more than just footsteps on the floor. We were expecting Sister Rosie and the other guardians to sneak their way to the activity area to place our gifts under the Christmas tree. But someone came in from the outside of the building. The cold winds breezed across the hallway and into our rooms when somebody opened the door. And instead of subtle footsteps from someone sneaking in, we heard heavy thuds of boots on outside of the quarters. Along with the heavy steps was something getting dragged across the wooden floor. When one of the kids took a peek, his eyes widened out of shock. We asked him who it was, but he couldn't respond right away. When we forced him to answer our question, he described what he saw instead of mentioning his name. Based on the description, we knew right away that he was describing Santa Claus. At first, we did not believe him even though it was obvious that he was utterly shocked by what he saw. We decided to get out of the room and see the man for ourselves. We quietly walked into the hallway and I saw some smudged prints of boots on the floor. Based on the tracks of mud and snow, we confirmed that somebody from outside had entered the building, and he headed to the activity area. I felt a mix of emotions as we carefully moved ahead while trying not to make the floor squeak. Although we were excited to see him, we were also quite wary. Along the trails of mud and snow, there were also traces of blood on the floor. We slowly crept inside the activity area, and all of us were completely dumbfounded when we saw the big man standing on the side of the Christmas tree. Just like how the other kid had described him, it was no other than Santa himself. A huge man with a silver beard wearing a red coat and black boots became an image of kindness and warmth because of the stories that we were told, but that was far from what we felt while staring at this massive stranger. The Christmas tree that we put up every year was roughly 9 feet tall, but he was even taller than the tree. His size alone was very intimidating to say the least. While I stared at the stains on the furry sleeves of his coat, I also realized something that brought chills down my spine. The real color of his coat was white. It was only turned to red by the thick stains of blood that were dried out by the cold. Aside from his heavily stained clothes, the sack that he had with him was also covered in blood. I wanted to tell the others what I just noticed, but the big man suddenly turned his head towards us. As I was about to walk away, he suddenly called me by my name. Even though we tried to hide ourselves behind the shelves, he knew that we were staring at him ever since we got there. And just like in the stories, the man knew all of us. He called each of our names. Instead of being excited to meet Santa in flesh, we were frozen in fear when we saw his face. The image of Santa in the stories was endearing, but the one right before us was incredibly terrifying. With a sickening grin on his face, he displayed his filthy sharp set of teeth. His eyes were droopy and deeply recessed from his swollen eye sacs that it looked like he hasn't slept for years. His ears were pointed like that of a hairless hound's, and his skin was almost gray. We were so afraid that we couldn't move from where we stood. The giant man in blood-stained clothes grabbed his sack and sat on the couch, which instantly collapsed under his weight. He was so big that he almost filled the space that was meant for 3 adults. He began to call us one by one with a smile on his face. Just like the tradition, this terrifying man made us sit on his lap and asked us to whisper in his ear what we wanted for Christmas. Some of us tried to run, but the door closed shut on its own and we couldn't open it no matter how hard we tried. One of them even pissed their pants out of fear. When it was finally my turn, I was sweating profusely while my knees were wobbling as I moved closer to him. Reluctantly, I sat on his lap and whispered in his long, pointy ears what I wanted as a gift. His breath was so foul, and then a smell of rotting corpse suddenly came out when he opened his bloody sack to grab my gift. I tried my best not to throw up when I saw what was inside. Along the boxes of presents, there were severed human body parts in the sack. I also learned how his clothes were stained so badly when he wiped off the blood on the box by rubbing it across his jacket before handing it to me. I ignored what I saw and walked away after receiving my present. The next person he called was Vinny, and it was then when things got even more horrifying than it already was. Vinny often played pranks with the other orphans, and Santa was well aware of his antics. He tried to act brave as he sat on his lap to receive a present. Since he was a naughty child, Vinny received a punishment instead. Santa lifted him up by the neck and held him over his sack. As he struggled to free himself from his grip, countless snakes sprung out from the sack and coiled around his body. Snakes were Vinny's greatest fear, and Santa used it to punish him. They wrapped around Vinny until he was completely covered. When he tried to scream, one of the snakes entered his mouth. Santa threw him on the floor and let the snakes handle him. Vinny was so petrified that he passed out. The other kids and I screamed as loud as we could to get some help, but nobody came to our aid. Santa kept on giving out the gifts and punishing the naughty kids. One of the orphans who was terrified of bees was stung countless times until his entire body was swollen. When all of us were already called, the big man in his blood-stained clothes finally got up from the couch and left. We immediately ran to the quarters of Sister Rosie and the other guardians, and we realized why they were unable to help us. The other orphans and I bellowed in terror and grief when we discovered that they were all killed. Their heads were hanging below their shoulders since their necks were severely twisted. Their limbs were broken in several places as well. Ironically, the kids who received their gifts had the exact wish that they wrote on the letter. Santa was not the kind man that the stories had described. He probably wasn't even a human at all.